Ecclesiastes chapter 7, and in just a moment we'll begin reading in verse 15 down through the rest of the chapter. On these Wednesday nights we are going through the book of Ecclesiastes, and we have found that it is a very different and sometimes a very difficult book. Solomon wrote 3 books that are in your Bible, and they're all very unique. You can't treat all 3 books exactly the same. In the book of Proverbs, it is a book of short sayings, of truisms, or proverbs. I have sketched out about 15 character sketches from the book of Proverbs. I'd love to go through, maybe starting this fall sometime. And then you have Song of Solomon. We went through it last summer in our adult Sunday school class. Very romantic, at times erotic. Not another book in the Bible like the book of Song of Solomon. And then you have Ecclesiastes. It is the memoirs of a man who loved God, left God, and came back to God. And whenever you approach a book like this, you need to get a general lay or a general feel of the book before you try to understand it. That's why before you preach through a book, you ought to read it a number of times to know what is in the book from beginning to end. And getting a general grasp of the book, it may be as simple as knowing that the first half of Ephesians is doctrinal and the last half is practical. I have some commentaries in my library of commentators who have a knack for outlining and outlining and outlining. John Phillips, for example, he would outline the different sections, and then he would alliterate, outline every chapter, and then every verse and every word in the verse. And it's a whole lot more than what I can do, that is for sure. You don't necessarily have to do that, but you do need to get a general feel for the flow of the book. And Ecclesiastes is one of the more difficult books to do that because there are sections that seem to be disconnected. I believe that the overall theme of the book is that it is not possible to achieve happiness or fulfillment on your own, but fulfillment in life comes through discovering your God-ordained purposes and living life in that track. But keeping it straight is not always as easy to do as you read through the book. So this morning I went back to chapter 1, and I just reread the book and make sure that I am staying on track. I believe that in chapter 1 and 2, the theme is the vanity of life without God. Life is just an endless cycle. You are on this wheel, you are moving, but you are going nowhere. And if you seek happiness in this world, you'll find that this world has nothing to offer you that satisfies. It's chapter 1 and 2. Amen. Chapter 3, 4, and 5 is the mystery of God and His timing. It begins in chapter 3 with that famous section, to everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under the heavens. And whereas there was no talk of God in the first 2 chapters, God is considered a lot in chapter 3, 4, and 5. Life is seen as a gift from God. You can only navigate the good and the bad that life brings you when you recognize the goodness of God and the sovereignty of God. You find that in chapter 3, 4, and 5. You get to chapter 6, chapter 7, and chapter 8 is where you juxtapose the hand of God against the frustrations of life. And this is where you begin to get some answers. That's what these chapters are about. Chapter 7, I believe, is about perspective. This chapter is considered by many as the central chapter. It is the one that brings it all together. This is where you take the mysteries and the injustices of life and you look at it through the lens of providence and goodness and sovereignty, and God's in the picture, and that is when you begin to get understanding. We looked last week in the first 10 verses about the things that are better, these better things, and they make no sense unless you have God in the picture. is a different perspective, but it is the right perspective. We come tonight to verse 15 to verse 29. And for me, it is without a doubt the most difficult section in the book of Ecclesiastes. And the way that I have approached these verses is as Solomon saying that there are some deep mysteries of life that I have pondered. And in my experience, I can give you some caution, some warnings that will help you navigate through these mysteries. I have learned some very hard-learned lessons taught me by wisdom. We call this a wisdom book. So you would expect to find wisdom in it. There are two words found often in your Bible. It is the word knowledge and the word wisdom. They're different. Knowledge is the accumulation of facts, math, science, English, sometimes useless facts, mindless trivia. That's knowledge. There are some people who are a walking encyclopedia. They have a head full of facts. Usually those people don't have very good social skills. Sometimes those people don't even have good hygiene skills. They have a lot of facts in their head. Wisdom is knowing how to use those facts to better your life. Knowledge looks at the weather report and sees that it is going to rain tomorrow. Wisdom says, I better take an umbrella to work with me when I leave the house. You see, knowledge will puff you up and it'll make you proud of what you know. Wisdom will humble you and it'll give you a good life. And Solomon has observed the mysteries of life and he has learned some hard facts. But God has given him wisdom now to live in light of those facts. And with that in mind, I believe that Solomon gives us some hard-learned lessons that he learned in life. The first lesson that he learns is what I will call a lesson on not being sanctimonious. Look at verse 15. All things have I seen in the days of my vanity. So you know the reference point. I have seen there is a just man that perisheth in his righteousness. There is a wicked man that prolongeth his life in his wickedness. He says, here's what I've seen. I have seen a good man, a just man, a righteous man die in his prime. I have seen some wicked men live a lot longer than they should have. Verse 16. Here's the application then. Be not righteous over much, neither make thyself over wise. Why shouldest thou destroy thyself? Be not over much wicked, neither be thou foolish. Why shouldest thou die before thy time? Well, let's just stop right there. There are no three verses in your Bible that have been more misinterpreted than the three verses that I just read to you. If the righteous man dies in his prime and the wicked man could live longer than he's supposed to, then don't worry too much about the righteousness and don't worry too much about the wickedness, because it may not help you in the end anyway. Oh, those are some difficult verses, aren't they? In chapter 3 and verse 12, Solomon said, I know. The best thing for a man is for a man to rejoice and to do good in his life. Chapter 14 and verse 12, the last verse in the entire book. For God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. So Solomon says you ought to be good, you ought to be just, you ought to be righteous. There's an admonition to righteousness, but how righteous should one try to be? Can you overdo it in your striving for righteousness? What is he saying in these three verses? There are different interpretations given by different commentators. I want to give you a couple of them tonight. You have to put your thinking cap on. I'm not going to rush through these 3 verses, though I know that they are heavy. We've got to take our time. I want you to understand them. What a lot of commentators have taken verse 15, 16, and 17 to mean is that Solomon is advocating for what is called the golden mean. If you've ever taken algebra, you know that mean doesn't mean rude. Mean is average. It's a math term. In philosophy, it is the median. The golden mean was an ancient Greek philosophy. It was first postulated by this guy named Aristotle. And Aristotle said that the golden middle way is the desirable middle between 2 extremes, one of excess and the other of deficiency. For example, Aristotle said that courage is a virtue. But excessive courage leads to recklessness. If you don't have any courage, then you're a coward. So you need to have enough courage, but not too much courage. You need to be right down in the middle. So a lot of commentators have taken that philosophy because that seems to be what Solomon is saying, and they apply this to this verse. And if that is what Solomon is saying, then Solomon is basically be too holy, don't be too wicked, don't sin too much. That seems to be, you're not committing. You're looking at me like you got this one on your own, preacher. I'm not going to help you here. Since I have seen the righteous die young and I have seen the wicked die old, don't fret yourself either way, because true value lies in the middle, true virtue lies in the middle of self-mortification on one end and self-indulgence on the other end. Moderation is better than fanaticism. Is that what Solomon is saying? Now, when you take that philosophy and you apply it to this verse, then verse 16 and 17 is the answer of verse number 15. Solomon must be saying then that since personal righteousness is no guarantee of a long life or a trouble-free life, then the best course is just to steer right down the middle. Now, if that's what Solomon is saying, then every commentator says he's saying it while viewing life merely under the sun. He has backed God out of the equation, and he's back to chapter 1 and chapter 2. One commentator really struggled with verse 15, 16, and 17. And so he finally resolved the mystery by inserting the word saying at the end of verse 15. Here's how he read it. All things have I seen in the days of my vanity. There is a just man that perisheth in his righteousness. There is a wicked man that prolongeth his life in his wickedness, saying, Be not righteous overmuch, neither make thyself overwise. Why shouldest thou destroy thyself? And so what he has is verse 16 as the uninspired answer of a wicked man, looking at the mystery of verse number 15. Then he brings Solomon back into the text in verse 17 to answer the wicked man by saying, hey, you better not be too wicked. Go mess up. Well, I think he's really twisting himself into a pretzel, trying to add words to the scripture to make it fit. There are others that have looked at this passage, and for them, it is simply a warning against fanaticism. They don't buy into this philosophy of don't sin too much to gold and mean, but they do believe that we should stay away from extremism in our religion. An illustration of that would be the Pharisees. If anybody was righteous over much, then it would be the Pharisees. But the word righteous in that case it means religious, it means ritual. It's not true righteous. They had pious practices. The Pharisee believed that the more pious, the more outwardly they conformed to some tradition or to some law, that equated to righteousness. And so what Solomon could be saying is that extreme legalism, extreme works, extreme asceticism is not going to guarantee you a long life. Likewise, when you see good people suffer, don't fall into the ditch on the other side and think that unbridled and unrestrained wickedness is not going to cost you. They say it is a warning against fanaticism, extremism. I listened to a man preach a message this week from this passage. And his point from this passage was avoiding extremes. If this is a warning not to be too extreme in your righteousness, then maybe it is okay to have a glass of wine with your meal. Because teetotaler would be the extreme. That's what modernists and progressives believe. In fact, even in our Baptist churches. Don't be a fanatic. Don't draw the line too tight on dress and music and theater and all of that. We're not saying that there are no absolutes, but maybe they are not as absolute as we have said that they are. This could be a warning against having too much righteousness, having too much of a standard, staying away from sin too much. If this is a warning against fanaticism, then that has to be the application. So what do these verses say? I think to understand 15, 16, and 17, you need to back up to verse 14. In the day of prosperity, be joyful. But in the day of adversity, consider. God also has set the one over against the other, to the end that man should find nothing after him. What Solomon says in verse 14 is that God has made both prosperity and adversity, and we have to live with both. You don't really know what life is going to hold. You don't know what is coming tomorrow, so you have to trust God. If you have prosperity, then rejoice. If you have adversity, then look to God in your trouble. But then a question comes to Solomon's mind. All right, if prosperity and adversity comes to all men, then what about the principle that if good men have adversity and if wicked men have prosperity, then what about the principle that righteousness brings blessings, prosperity, and sin brings cursings, adversity? We know that that is true. Is that a valid principle? And if it is not a valid principle, then why worry about being righteous or wicked, since it has no bearing on the kind of life that you're going to live anyway? And you'll see that struggle over that question in the book of Job, over and over. Well, the principle is valid, that righteousness does produce blessing, and that wickedness does produce cursing. However, there are some exceptions to that rule. And in verse number 15 are the exceptions. In fact, here's the rule, Deuteronomy 4 and verse 40. Thou shalt keep therefore his statutes and his commandments, which I command thee this day, that it may go well with thee, and with thy children after thee, that thou mayest prolong thy days upon the earth, which the Lord thy God giveth thee forever. That's the rule. Exodus 20 and verse number 12. Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. That is the general rule. Blessing and obedience brings, or obedience and righteousness brings the blessings of God. There's exceptions to that. In fact, hold your finger right here. Go to Job chapter 21. Job wrestled with this. In Job chapter 21, and if you would, in verse number 7. Job 21 and verse 7, wherefore do the wicked live? Become old. They are mighty in power. Their seed is established in their sight with them, and their offspring before their eyes. Their houses are safe from fear, neither is the rod of God upon them. Their bull gendereth and faileth not, their cow calveth and casteth not her calf. They send forth their little ones like a flock, and their children dance, and they take the timbrel and harp and rejoice at the sound of the organ. They spend their days in wealth, and in a moment go down to the grave. You know what Job is struggling with? He's struggling with the exceptions. It doesn't negate the rule, but it's those exceptions that confound us. Asaph in Psalm 73. Asaph, he struggled with the same thing. You know this passage. Look at it, Psalm 73 and verse number 3. And Asaph said, I was envious at the foolish when I saw the prosperity of the wicked, for there are no bands in their death, but their strength is firm. They are not in trouble as other men, neither are they plagued like other men. Therefore pride compasses them about as a chain. Violence covereth them as a garment. Their eyes stand out with fatness. They have more heart. They have more than heart could wish. Now Asaph is going to get his answers later on in the chapter. But every one of us have believed the rule, but bothered about the exceptions. I know a lot of wicked men that I wonder, why don't they get their just reward? Why do they get to live the way that they do? I know a lot of righteous men. Why is their life so hard? Why so much adversity that has come to them? And so I believe that Solomon in verse number 15, he is acknowledging the exceptions. I know that God blesses the righteous and God curses the wicked man, but sometimes God, in His providence, in His wisdom, in His sovereignty, sometimes God gives prosperity to the righteous and sometimes lets a wicked man prosper for a while. Righteousness does not guarantee you prosperity. Amen. And wickedness does not guarantee that you're going to suffer and die prematurely. Sometimes God executes judgment speedily. Sometimes God delays judgment. With that understanding, verse 16. Don't be not righteous over much, neither make thyself over wise. Why shouldest thou destroy thyself? I believe that you have to read that in the context of verse 14 and 15. Don't think that you can be so righteous and so wise that you can escape adversity and guarantee prosperity. I'll give you an example of it. I believe that a lot of our health problems we bring upon ourselves. Our diet, too much sugar and Dr. Pepper and fast food, that is a sure way to bad health. Now, I'm not preaching to you. I'm just as guilty as you are. So some people look at that truth and they decide we're going to beat the odds. And they become health extremists. Clean eating, plant-based, no red meat, all natural, filtered water. You can take this really to the extreme. Now, they're right in principle. And I would say that they have a greater chance of living a long, healthy life. You still get cancer. You still die at an early age. You don't know what genes are in you. You don't know what diseases are dormant in you. You don't know what was inherent when you were born. So you can't be too healthy. You cannot be so healthy that you can't have some disease someday. There are exceptions to the rule. I believe that's the essence of verse 16. You can be fanatically self-righteous and spend your life trying to be as wise as you possibly can, but don't think that you have found a fail-proof way to a long life. Even if you become the most perfect man who ever lived, even if you become the most wisest man who ever lived, you're not going to exempt yourself from adversity. You know who would know that? Solomon. The wisest man who ever lived. Then verse 17. Be not overmuch wicked, neither be thou foolish. Why shouldest thou die before thy time? On the other hand, don't throw off all the restraints of morality and righteousness and go live this life of unbridled sin. Since some wicked men have judgment that is delayed and they've lived to a long life, don't think that you're guaranteed the same outcome. You go live a life of wickedness and foolishness, and the good chances are you're going to die before your time. I know there's exceptions, verse 15. I know there's exceptions, but you're probably not going to be the exception. What you're going to end up doing in verse 17 is you're going to die before your time. So what's the approach? Verse 18. It is good that thou shouldest take hold of this. Ye also from this withdraw not thine hand. What do you do? For he that feareth God shall come forth of them all. Well, the best way to do it is just fear God. Just trust the Lord. Just obey the Lord. Just depend on the Lord. Prosperity of adversity. Rejoice in prosperity. Trust in adversity. Just fear God. There's a caution being too sanctimonious. There's a second lesson I believe that he teaches us in this passage. And that's a lesson on not being sensitive. Look at verse 20. Also, take no heed unto all words that are spoken, lest thou hear thy servant curse thee. For oftentimes also thine own heart knoweth that thou thyself likewise hast cursed others. All this have I proved by wisdom. I said I would be wise, but it was far from me. That which is far off and exceeding deep, who can find it out? Solomon says in verse number 20, he says, there's not a just man upon earth that doeth good and sinneth not. Now that's a great verse I've used before and I've heard used in soul winning to prove to a man that he's a sinner, and that's a good proof text. I believe that when Solomon writes that, he means for you to take it personally. That means you. It's not meant for you to look at everybody else and say, yep, everybody else is a sinner. No, it's meant for you to look at yourself and say, yeah, that's me. I am a sinner. And the reason why that you need to acknowledge that is that if you acknowledge that you are a sinner, it'll help you have grace toward other sinners. If I ever achieve perfection, it's going to be really hard for me to live with you sinners. Because the higher you view yourself, the lower you will view others. So he says, there's not a just man upon earth that doeth good and sinneth not. And then he says in verse 21 and verse 22, then don't be so thin-skinned about everything that is said about you, and don't take it personally. Take no heed unto all words that are spoken, lest thou hear thy servant curse thee. Can I paraphrase it? Let some things roll off your back. Right? Someone criticizes you. You've probably done the same thing. That's right. Isn't it amazing that we can gossip about someone gossiping about us? That's what he says in verse 22 or verse 22. For oftentimes also thine own heart knoweth that thou thyself likewise hast cursed others. We can run people down for running us down and not even recognize we're doing the same thing we're mad at them for. Yeah. Don't be so sensitive. Can I pop your bubble tonight? Ye member of Victory Baptist Church, do not think that everyone in this church has always said good things about you. I'll guarantee you that every person in this room has had something negative or disparaging said about them by someone else in this room. Yeah. Now, some of you will get no sleep tonight trying to think of who it is. What did they say? Did they mean it? But don't get all bent out of shape of it. Because I bet that every person in this room has gone home and said something disparaging about somebody else in this room. So don't let criticism ruin your day, because you are just as guilty. Hey, can I help you tonight? There are some people that God's going to put in your life that are just hateful. Don't look at anybody. Don't look at anybody. There are some people that God puts in your life, they have a bad attitude. They don't treat you right. But you've probably been hateful too before. You've probably had a bad, don't look at anybody. You see, everybody gossips. Now maybe yours is in the form of a prayer request. But it is still gossip. Everybody is human. Everybody in this room has said something out of frustration or out of anger or out of fear or out of envy or out of not having all of the facts. And if someone curses you, just remember, you've probably done the same thing too. And then Solomon says, there's something I've tried to understand, but it's too deep for me. Look at verse 23. That which is far off and exceeding deep, who can find it out? What is it that is so deep that even man can't find it? Well, I think Jeremiah had the answer in Jeremiah 17 and verse 9. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? I, the Lord, search the heart. I try the reins, even to give every man according to his ways and according to the fruit of his deeds. The heart of man is so deep and can be so deceitful. You think that you know your heart, but only God knows what is really, really in the depths of your heart. Right. Jesus said in Luke 6 and verse 45, a good man out of the good treasure of his heart bringeth forth that which is good. An evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart bringeth forth that which is evil. For out of the abundance of the heart his mouth speaketh. James 3 and verse 9. Therefore, watch this. Bless we God, even the Father, and therewith curse we men, which are made after the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceedeth blessing, and out of the same mouth. Blessing and cursing. Where did that come from? I tell you where it came from. It came from your heart. So don't get so bent out of shape over what somebody said. Worry about what is in your own heart. Don't be sensitive. There's a third lesson that Solomon has learned in this passage. It is a lesson on not being sensual. Look at verse 25. I applied my heart to know and to search and to seek out wisdom and the reason of things, and to know the wickedness of folly, even of foolishness and madness. And I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets, and her hands as bands. Whoso pleaseth God shall escape from her, but the sinner shall be taken by her. Behold, this have I found, saith the preacher, counting one by one to find out the account, which yet my soul seeketh, but I find not. One man among 1,000 have I found, but a woman among all those have I not found. He's drawing from his experiences, and he offers a very hard-learned lesson. It is the folly of indulging in the sensual pleasures of women outside of the biblical bonds of marriage of one man and one wife. You could think that Solomon is sour on women, but he's saying more about himself than women. He's married 1,000 women. 700 wives, 300 concubines, the first of them being the daughter of Pharaoh. Most of these are political arrangements. Some of them were to satiate the unbridled lust that he had. And the predictable end is that they all turned his heart away from God. Right. And in verse 25, he says, I look back on it all to see what went wrong, because it sure did go wrong. And Solomon says, from my experience, if you marry the wrong woman, life can be worse than death. Her charms is like a snare. Her allure is a trap that has entrapped many men. If you get a good wife, you are blessed for it. If not, you're in trouble. Solomon would say in Proverbs 21 and verse 9, it is better to dwell on a corner of the housetop than with a brawling woman in a wide house. Verse 19, it is better to dwell in the wilderness than with a contentious and an angry woman. Chapter 19 and verse 13, a foolish son is the calamity of his father, and the contentions of a wife are a continual dropping. Chapter 27 and verse 15, a continual dropping, drip, 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 in a very rainy day, and a contentious woman are alike. Now you would think that Solomon, sour women, does Solomon hate women? Well, no. He said in Proverbs 18, he said, whoso findeth a wife findeth a good thing. He says in chapter 9, in verse number 9, he says, live joyfully with the wife wife whom thou lovest all the days of the life of thy vanity. It is singular. The wife that God has given you, love her and live joyfully with her. Solomon says in verse number 28, he says, I've known 1,000 men, and I found one true friend among them. But he said, I've loved 1,000 women. And all of them were a great disappointment because none of them loved me back. They became a snare to me. They led me away from God. I've been deeply disappointed in love and marriage because he strayed from God's way. It is a man who has violated every Bible principle concerning marriage. One wife, not a heathen. Fidelity to that one wife. True love. He never followed those principles. And all that he found was deep disappointment. Solomon says, drawing from my own experiences, I have learned some hard lessons. I have learned that you cannot be so righteous that you never see trouble. I have learned not to get so bent out of shape over criticism because you can't stop it. We've all participated. I have learned that the love of one woman would have been better than the affection of 1,000 women. And that's what wisdom is. It's observing life, and it is learning hard lessons that will stay with you. There are some people that go through difficulties and they never learn anything from it. But he's observed life, the good and the bad. He gives us lessons that we don't have to experience to learn. You can learn them by observing his life. 3 hard-learned lessons. I hope that when you read Ecclesiastes 7, verse 15 through 29, that you have understanding as to what that passage